This is one of the most useful hand planes that Stanley ever made. So, of course, Stanley doesn't make it anymore. Fortunately, this is something that you can make, and you may be able to make it better than Stanley. A router plane is a plane that reaches down into a mortise, a dado, or a groove and lets you shave the bottom. Extremely useful for fine-tuning joinery, making inlays, setting hinges, and other hardware. Wooden router planes have been around like forever, but in the late 1800s, Stanley and several other manufacturers began making these metal versions. This is a Stanley 71. Type 12 for all you hand plane nerds. It's a great tool, but a router plane is something you reach for when you need to finesse your work, and this is a little too beefy to be finessable in all circumstances. So, in the 1920s, Stanley introduced its little brother, the 271. The advantage of the smaller plane is immediately apparent to any craftsman that has to do delicate, exacting work. As you can see, it's an extremely simple tool. Just a base, a plane iron, and a boss that serves as a holder for the iron and a handle to guide the plane. Stanley stopped making the 271 in the 1970s. And although there are still some small router planes available, they tend to be pretty pricey. And none of them have dealt with what I believe to be the one shortcoming of this otherwise fantastic little tool. You can't actually see what you're cutting. But we're going to fix that right now by making our own router plane and incorporating some modern materials. The base of the old 271 and other small router planes are made from metal, usually iron or bronze. But they don't have to be. You can make a router plane base from acrylic plastic that actually lets you see down into the cut. But won't the plastic get scratched? Well, yes it will, but not nearly as deeply or as badly as you might think. This is a small router plane that I've made nearly 20 years ago. Of all the planes that I've shown you, this is my favorite. I use it often, and as you can see, it's still pretty transparent. And if you're willing to do a little maintenance, you can keep the scratches at bay with mirror glaze or another abrasive compound that's made for polishing plastic. Cut the base from 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter thick plastic using a pair of hole saws. But first, cut a wide dado halfway through the plastic, stopping where you're going to create the opening. This creates a mouth in the base and lets you use the plane to make flush cuts. Cut the outside diameter of the plane with a large hole saw and the inside opening with a smaller hole saw. Drill and countersink 2 small screw holes in the bottom surface of the base. Later, you'll use these holes to mount the handle. Note that for all these operations, I've attached the plastic to a scrap board with double-sided tape. This increases control and keeps your hands out of danger. Next, we need to procure a plane iron, this little L-shaped piece of tool steel. There are still some vendors who offer plane irons for small router planes, some reasonably priced and some less so. However, if you want to live dangerously, we can make our own from this, a hex key or an Allen wrench. Whatever you call it, these little guys are made from tool steel. And with some judicious cutting, grinding, and sharpening, we can make them into a plane iron. To do this, the first thing you need is a vise to hold this sucker while you judiciously cut and grind. Use softwood for this, such as spruce or poplar. Avoid plywood. Put the hex key in between 2 small blocks so that both the short arm and the long arm rest on the wood surface. Squeeze them together in a vise so that the key leaves its impression on both pieces of wood. Cut the block short, removing the impression of the short arm. Then screw the blocks back together with the long arm between them and the short arm sticking out a short distance. Not only does this hold the hex key secure as you grind it, it holds the short arm perfectly horizontal to the table or the guide as you grind. First, Cut off the short arm so that it's no more than 3/4 of an inch or 19 millimeters long. Flatten the end of the short arm using a disc sander or strip sander. This forms the back of the plane iron. The hex key was made with the short arm square to the long arm, but you want to grind at a very slight angle so that the flattened back will be just a few degrees more than 90 to the long arm. This will create a relief angle so that just the cutting edge of the plane iron will touch the wood. Turn the vise around and grind the bevel of the plane iron. The angle between the bevel and the back should be between 25 and 30 degrees. Finish up by sharpening the iron on a set of stones. I'm using diamond stones for this task. Keep the bevel and the back pressed flat against the stones as you work. Grinding tool steel requires some care. You have to be careful not to get the steel too hot or it loses its temper. That is, it gets too soft to hold a sharp edge. That's why I continually dip the steel in water while I worked. But should you get the steel too hot, there's no need to wail and gnash your teeth. You can restore the temper with this simple trick. Heat the business end of the plane iron with a torch until it glows a dull red. Then plunge it into a can of paste wax. There may be a little flame, but if you're ready for it, you can control it. Had I quenched this tool in water, it would have made it hard again, but there's a chance that it would have made it too hard, very brittle. The wax cools down the steel more slowly, making it hard, but not too hard, tempered. Well, we're in the home stretch now. All we need is a handle for this plane and a place to hold the plane iron. Select a really hard piece of wood for this part. I've got here a beautiful piece of hard bird's eye maple that ought to make a spectacular handle. If you've made your own iron from a hex key, measure the diameter across the points and drill a hole to match all the way through the handle. Then turn the stock 90 degrees and drill a second hole to hold the threaded brass insert. This hole is stopped and only goes part way through. Turn the stock again and make the small pilot holes for the screws that will hold the handle to the base. Cut the rough shape of the handle with a bandsaw or a scroll saw or a coping saw. Using files and drum sanders, round the handle and make it comfortable to hold, then sand it perfectly smooth. Install the threaded brass insert in the side with a little epoxy and apply a finish. When the finish is dry, wax the handle and rub it out nice and smooth so that it's just a pleasure to touch. Then it's time to assemble this sucker. Attach the handle with 2 small flathead screws. Insert the long arm of the plane iron through the handle and mount a thumb screw in the threaded insert. To lock the plane iron in the handle, simply tighten the thumb screw. One more tip. You want to be able to adjust the plane iron flush with the bottom of the plane, and depending on the bend in the hex key from which you made the plane iron, you may have to remove just a little bit of stock from right there. You can either file it away or carve it away with a gouge. See that? Perfect. Now, let's see how this works. I've got a small door here, which needs a couple of hinges. I've traced the outline of each hinge on the edge of the door, and I'll remove most of the stock with a chisel. But as you well know, it's almost impossible to get a hinge mortise perfectly level with a chisel. So take your router plane and set the plane iron to remove just a smidge of wood from the bottom of the mortise. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this unit of measurement, a smidge is roughly equal to the thickness of a piece of masking tape. Place the pieces of masking tape over the wood at each end of the hinge mortise. Place the router plane over the tape, loosen the plane iron, and let the plane iron drop so that it touches the wood. Tighten the thumb screw to lock in the depth of cut and remove the tape. The plane iron is now set to remove just a smidge from the bottom of the hinge mortise. You can also use metal shims to set the depth of cut. With these particular shims, I can set the plane iron to remove just 5/1000ths of an inch. That's almost the same thing as a smidge, it's just not as sticky. When you're satisfied with the depth of cut, begin planing. Note the movement. I don't push the router plane straight ahead. Instead, I hold one side of the handle stationary and pivot the other side around it. This gives me both leverage and control. When you get close to the desired depth, you can use the hinge itself to set the depth of cut. Place the hinge on the bottom of the plane and adjust the iron so that the cutting edge just touches the edge of the hinge leaf. Plane away the last little bit of stock and fit the hinge to the mortise. There, good enough for government work. If you'd like the plans and the full-size patterns for this router plane, you can follow the link in the description or click on the tag floating somewhere over my head. And thanks.